A few Christmases ago, I was driving my kids back from visiting their grandparents out in the countryside. They moved out to this big old house once my dad sold his business, one of those offers he couldn't refuse type things that meant he could retire like 10 years earlier than expected. The house is amazing, but the only problem is that it's in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where the nearest village is like 20 minutes drive away. It's also one heck of a drive to and from the place, one that involves traversing some pretty secluded stretches of motorway. So like I said, it's maybe only a week before Christmas. It's the 16th or 17th of December, and my kids are really bloody excited about it. My wee lad is still 5 years old, a true Santa believer, while my daughter had only just turned 9, so they're starting to cotton on that something isn't quite right about the whole thing, but they still sort of want to believe, if that makes any sense. So when they see a hand-painted Christmas light-dripping sign that says something like Santa's Grotto 9 miles, they start going ballistic in the back seat, demanding I take them to see Santa. At first, I straight up refuse. It was a long enough drive without pulling into some lay-by to spend the better part of an hour nattering away with some old fella in a red suit. But the pair of them throw an absolute fit, to the point where I decided I would get far more peace if I just capitulated and let them spend a few minutes indulging their childish imaginations. Like I said, my eldest was just on the cusp of figuring out that Santa was just Mom and Dad sneaking out in the middle of the night to take their presents out of the car boot before stashing them under the Christmas tree. And every time I imagined her getting older, getting wiser, figuring things out, becoming a young adult, it had me choking up like nobody's business. So I suppose I just wanted to enjoy the naivete just a wee bit longer. Besides, once she'd figured out the truth, it was only a matter of time before she spilled the beans to my youngest. And that was a day I most definitely wasn't looking forward to. So after a few more signs like Santa's Grotto 3 miles, I finally see the turnoff that I needed to take to get to the grotto. It takes me down this long, dark dirt track that at first I thought might have been the wrong turnoff. But lo and behold, after about 5 minutes or so, I see another one of those janky hand-painted signs for Santa's Grotto. The kids are just about ready to burst at this point, but I make it clear that we're not staying any longer than 10 minutes, and they're to be on their best behavior, leaving when I tell them to leave, lest Santa see what bad little children they are. The threat of coal in their stockings was more than enough to have them promising to be good. Anyway, I expected a quaint little winter wonderland type thing with a few other families milling around, but the place was barely even decorated and looked completely deserted. It was little more than porta-cabin with a few caravans parked around it. Like I'm not messing when I say whoever was in charge of this place had put more effort into decorating the road signs than the actual site itself. I had a bad feeling from the get-go, but I knew better than to reverse myself and tell the kids to get back in the car. They'd have gone absolutely mental getting so close to meeting Santa, only to be told that I'd just up and changed my mind. So, against my better judgment, I decided to give the place a chance. We walked up to the porta-cabin, which seems to be the place where the grotto was, and knocked on the door. There was no reply at first, so we knocked again, and as we did so, one of the doors to the caravan swings open, and this heavier-set older fellow with a big gray beard sticks his head out and gives me a death stare. I look over at him, and in my cheeriest voice I ask, "We're here to see Santa. Is he around?" I give a quick nod towards the kids as if to say the fella, who I was guessing was the one playing Santa, to get himself together so the kids wouldn't throw a fit. He doesn't say a word at first. He just stares at me almost like looking through me, like there was nothing behind his eyes at all. He finally says something like, "I'll go fetch him," then shuts the door, only to re-emerge a few moments later dressed in what was without a doubt the worst-looking Santa suit I've ever seen in my life. Not only was it lacking any kind of white felt, there was no belt or anything. The bloke had pretty much just thrown together a collection of red clothes and then whacked on a cheap Santa hat to round the look off. On top of that, the clothes were absolutely filthy, covered in grease stains with a collection of what appeared to be his cigarette burns in the pants. He walked towards the kids and asked them if they were excited to see him. They gave each other this cartoonish look as if to say, "Who is this guy?" and the bloke has to repeat the question in a characteristically festive voice before they even really twig to the fact that this was Santa Claus. They just sort of nod at first, watching in confusion as he takes out the key from the red pants and unlocks the porta-cabin before beckoning them inside. The interior was absolutely terrifying. Like I'm a grown woman, and even I got the creeps from stepping inside that thing. It was dark and grimy, and the use of cheap Christmas lights managed to give the place a kind of festive torture chamber type vibe, as opposed to the cozy grotto feeling they were obviously aiming for. The crowning piece of creepiness was the fact that, mounted on one wall, was what I guessed was an old sheep's skull that had some plastic deer antlers taped or glued to the top of it. It would have been creepy enough in broad daylight, but the fact that it was being partially, then fully illuminated by red and green flashing lights gave it a truly hellish aesthetic. Santa sat down on a grubby old couch that stunk of pee and old ale, then smacked his knees as if to invite the kids to go sit on his lap. Neither of them moved. Their lack of reaction prompted Santa to give them something of a scowl before he very curtly asked them what each of them wanted for Christmas. Both of the kids were so nervous by that point that I had to prompt them to reply. The awkward exchange went on for a few more minutes until I turned to the kids and told them we had to leave. As I'm ushering the kids out of the porta-cabin and back towards the car, I feel a hand grab the crook of my arm and squeeze. I turn to see Santa's face pushed right into mine, his breath reeking of ciggies and hard booze. 50 quid, he hissed. Sorry, Santa. I haven't got anything on me, I said, trying to be as polite as possible, maintaining a passive-aggressive tone. But I promised me and my husband will leave out some extra brandy and mince pies for you on Christmas night, just to make up for it. I don't even know I was keeping up the pretense by that point. I'm pretty sure the whole experience had scarred my wee lad for life and had pretty much destroyed any remaining festive belief in my daughter. Santa growled back at me, calling me an expletive. I just keep pushing my kids back towards the car, turning back briefly to see that Santa is no longer alone. He was never alone. A gang of other people have filed out of the caravans and are following us back towards where I'd parked the car. Then starts off the chorus of, "Where do you think you're going, love? You haven't paid. He told you 50 quid, get your purse out, or we'll get it out for you." My kids were on the verge of tears at that point, and if I'm being honest, I wasn't far off either. I gave in, took out my purse, and started sifting through it to see if I had 50 in notes on me. Right as I'm doing that, this kid, this actual bloody child, just snatches the whole thing out of my hand and runs back towards the caravan with it, only to be goaded on by the gang of skanky-looking grown-ups going, "Good lad, that'll teach her. She needs to learn some generosity. It is Christmas, after all." I didn't do a bloody thing. Well, aside from getting in the car and driving off. The damage control from that bit of horribleness was a lot of work. I'm pretty sure it was the singular event that broke my eldest kid's belief, and we had to reassure my youngest over and over that he was just a bad man pretending to be Santa, and that the real Santa would most definitely be putting him on the naughty list for what he'd done. But honestly, I think it's me that belongs on the naughty list for putting my kids in that position in the first place, and for putting myself in the most terrifying Christmas-related event I'd ever gone through. Far, far scarier than my first Christmas with my mother-in-law, if you can believe that.
Allow me to explain. I was a senior in high school at the time, and I was definitely not a popular kid. My friends and I were the oddities of the school, the few people who dared to defy the norm. It was them who told me about the deep web, a place on the internet where you are completely unwatched, anonymous, capable of doing whatever you wanted. Of course, I was intrigued. Most of my friends just used it to buy drugs, but I thought a little bit bigger. I wanted to know what happened in the darkest parts of the deep web, whether or not my friends were telling the truth when they talked about horrible fetish sites and assassins you can hire to kill anyone you'd like. Of course, I wasn't planning on using any of it. It was the mystery of it all that fascinated me. Going onto these sites would be like peering into a world only a few have ever seen, like an entirely new experience. At the time, I was tired of the monotony of life. I would get up at the same time every day, go to school, attend the same classes, talk to the same people, go home, play video games, do homework, go to sleep, and then repeat. I wondered if other people got tired of that. Anyway, it took me a while to actually dive into the deep web. As fascinated as I was, I had been warned of what could happen to me. Who isn't afraid of being threatened by hackers or stalked by some creep you pissed off online? That kind of shit kept me from actually going on the deep web. Until the day I manned up and decided that it was time. It was time to delve into the underbelly of the internet. Time to see a world that I'd only ever dreamed of. For the first week or so, it was fucking boring. It was just drug sites and stuff where people exposed government secrets, or whatever. Nothing as dark as I expected. I wasn't really into politics. I don't even do drugs. So that was useless to me. There wasn't really much I was into back then. So I was disappointed. The only reason I kept exploring was my sheer desire to experience the world I thought existed on the deep web. That world was darker than any drug site. That world had murder, torture, and all sorts of nasty shit. I eventually got my wish. The site didn't have a name. I thought it was a broken link for a bit, since it only led me to a black screen. Right before I could click out, however, a chat box opened up on the screen. Someone using the name admin typed in the chat box saying,
"Congratulations. You found the worst place on the fucking net."
I stared at the screen, more bemused than afraid. It took me a moment to type back, "Cool." That's all I said. What else was there to say? "Hey, I'm here to see your finest torture porn." A moment after, the admin replied,
"Ha ha. You want in?"
I hesitated. All those horror stories were flooding back to my head. But it was too late to chicken out now. This is what I came for. Even if I just clicked out at the first sign of danger, I had to see what was there. I had to know. Not allowing myself to stop, I hesitantly typed back, "Yeah." The chat box closed, and I was led directly to what looked like a video, with another chat box next to it. There were around 5 other people there, each eagerly waiting for something. The video was in black and white, and showed a small room. The only thing inside was a wooden chair. After around 5 minutes of waiting, the door to the room opened, and a man was shoved inside. He was blindfolded, and only had on a pair of black briefs. He was followed by a woman. She was dressed in all black, and her face was covered by a mask. In an instant, the chat room went wild. I almost closed the window to spare myself, knowing immediately where this was going. But again, I told myself that this was what I wanted. Maybe not the torture, but the window into the very worst parts of the world. The woman pulled a knife from her pocket and cut off the man's blindfold as she shoved him into the chair. He didn't struggle, and once his eyes were visible I could see why. It looked as if he had been drugged. Resisting was impossible. I frowned, glancing to the side. This was fucked up. I knew this was fucked up. My conscience told me to call the cops, or at least click off. But I forced myself to watch. She turned to the camera, pointing the knife at the man's throat. One of the people in the chat typed, "One of the fingers. Cut off one of his fingers." I clenched my hands into fists, taking in a sharp breath. Was this really fucking happening? Was I going to watch this guy get mutilated, as a small crowd of people watched in glee? I felt like throwing up, a feeling that only worsened when the woman nodded, and then turned to the man, grabbing his limp hand and carefully slicing off one of his fingers. Blood spurted from the wound, and the man moaned in pain, but he couldn't fight back. Breathing heavily, I hovered my cursor over the X, planning on getting the fuck out of there. But I didn't. The woman looked unsatisfied, as if she thought the people in the chat could do better. Another person called for her to slice up the man's arm, and she complied. He was bleeding heavily now, clearly in deep pain. But these people were fucking sick. They were cheering her on from the chat, suggesting new and painful tortures for her to inflict. Eventually, I stopped breathing heavily. I stopped feeling sick. Actually, it was starting to grow on me. By the end, the man was on the ground, covered in blood. I watched this for around half a minute. The people in the chat were starting to die down. They inflicted enough pain. They had their fun. Funny, I thought. How it was all over just when I was getting into it. I smirked. How exciting. This was better than any game I could play. Much better than any fucking class I could attend. Better than sitting with a group of fucking nobodies pretending like I cared for a goddamn second about them. This was the world I wanted to see. This was darkness. This was the underbelly. This was reality. Fucking end him. I typed in the chat for the first time. She nodded for the last time, bringing the man to his feet before slowly dragging her blade across his throat, sending more of his blood spurting out. Once it was done, she dropped him, and he fell to the ground, a lifeless husk. The people in the chat started complimenting the torturer, talking about how it had been another good time, starting to set the date for the next showing. On screen, the woman left the room, leaving the corpse behind. Of course, I quickly wrote down the date for the next showing. This was going to be a part of my life now. I was going to be a part of something bigger. I was going to command the death of these people. What a rush. So yeah, I still love the deep web. I'm in college now, and now I'm even more immersed in the deep web. I've seen shit some people would freak out just knowing exists. I finally broke the monotony of life. Isn't it inspirational? How one high schooler defies the inherent boredom of his life by discovering his true passion? I love the deep web.
If any of you guys watching this have been to or live in Northern California like me, we can all agree that there really is a lack of scary spots or paranormal activity in general. The Winchester Mystery House is still standing, but it's essentially transitioned into a tourist trap. It has tour guides and a gift shop now. Really takes the scare factor out of it. There are plenty of high crime or sketchy areas around here, but what I'm about to talk about is something completely different. What my friends and I encountered that night is something that still haunts me to this day. It was the middle of spring break that year, and my friends and I were bored out of our minds. Our flight to Miami got cancelled last minute, and we knew we were going to be at home for a bit longer. We were a bunch of bored teenagers longing for an adventure. We knew that we were bound to make a series of stupid decisions after this, but hey, we were young. It's what you do. Eventually, I was scrolling through TikTok, and I came across a pretty viral video on my For You page. The TikTok was part of a series on paranormal places and legends across America, and this legend was apparently based in San Jose, California, the closest major city to us. The TikTok described a tale of a tribe, if you will, of albino ghost-like people who come out at night and prey on unsuspecting travelers. They were known to perform various satanic activities and rituals. Some even blamed them for the mysterious disappearances of people on those mountains they reside in. Legend says that the blood albinos who lived there were cursed or were demonic beings from another plane of existence. Other online articles talked about a set of screaming ghost-like creatures who would sweep people away in weird ways. Many other people online even mentioned hearing loud, shrill shrieking noises every time they drove by there after sunset. I even found a news article from a rather credible news site mentioning the disappearance of a young man in those same hills. The man was a young, healthy hiker and had seemingly no reason to disappear like that. The police still haven't found his body to this day. But after doing a bit more research online on blood albinos, I came to the conclusion that it was probably some sort of weird cult or drug group up in the hills. I assumed the hiker's disappearance could have just been a plain coincidence. Urban legends are very easy to spread online, so I brushed it off as another dumb myth. I brought it up to 3 of my friends and we laughed it off. All of us were skeptical of the fact that there are so-called blood albinos, and we thought it was another stupid online myth. Most of my friends, including myself, were never into paranormal activity. We never even believed in ghosts in the first place, so it was quite interesting that we were even talking about this in the first place. But my friends and I were eager for an adventure. We were bored out of our minds and we were all blown away by how close this legend was to us. The so-called cursed mountains were only about 10 minutes away. We had way too much time on our hands and we wanted to check out what was up there. We wanted to be the ones that would prove that there were no such blood albinos up there and this was just a normal hill. If all else failed, then at least my friends and I would find ourselves a good smoke spot up there. The area seemed extremely remote, and we knew that no cop would be up there. Figuring we had nothing better to do, we set off at around 2 a.m. Coming with me were my friends Taylor, Kevin, and Jaime in the driver's seat. The things we brought with us included flashlights, phone chargers, and a few recreational drugs of our choice. We set our GPS to Hicks Road, San Jose, California, and we drove off. As we started driving up the hills, everything seemed pretty normal. The twisty mountain roads were nothing too atypical and we seemed to be going past a water reservoir. At this point, we let our guard down completely. We even started cracking jokes on how stupid this idea was and how people are afraid of everything. As we drove deeper into the hills, Kevin said that he found a Google Maps link on a forum. The link would guide you to a set of coordinates where supposedly the blood albinos were. We decided to say hell with it and go over to the coordinates. Every part of me told me that this was a horrible idea, but hell, my judgment was horrible at the time. But as we got there, things started to get legitimately eerie. There was no cell phone signal, and we were out in the woods at 3 a.m. If we screamed or cried for help, no one would hear us. Despite our gut feelings, we kept driving. As we reached the house, there was an extended driveway that stemmed from the main road. There were no house numbers, no streetlights, and no blood albinos either. As disappointed as we were still eager to explore the houses. We all got out of the car. Kevin and Taylor pulled out a joint, while Jaime and I went over to explore the house ourselves. As Jaime and I ventured throughout the houses, we didn't see anything too out of the ordinary. Graffiti, litter, and booze bottles were among the things we found there. Nothing too atypical for an old house. There was a star of Satan painted on the ground, but we didn't think much of it. Anyone could have put that there, especially a bored group of teenagers like us. There were a few more old sheds and structures, but again, it wasn't anything unusual. It was an ordinary abandoned neighborhood, unoccupied for a long, long amount of time. But as Jaime and I explored the back of the house, we noticed a path. But it wasn't a paved path. It was a path formed from years of people walking up and down there. Someone had been coming up there. Naturally, Jaime and I decided to explore the path. As we went down there, we heard a loud, ghastly yell. It sounded like a person, but it wasn't at the same time. The shrieks were almost controlled, almost like they were talking to someone. Whoever was making this noise sounded angry, almost territorial. We shined our flashlight roughly where the sound came from. We noticed a deer lying dead on the ground. It was dismembered and mutilated. At first, Jaime and I passed it off as a mountain lion attack. There are a lot of pumas in the hills, but the shrieks didn't sound like a deer or a mountain lion at all. And considering mountain lions drag their prey away, it made no sense why a mutilated deer was lying there. It just didn't add up. But as we looked up and around, Jaime and I froze. In the distance, not too far away from the deer, was a shadowy figure. We could barely make it out in the darkness, but as a reflex, I shined my flashlight at the figure. I thought it was Kevin trying to prank me. But as the light reflected, we realized the humanoid figure wasn't Kevin. It seemed to be some sort of creature that stood up on 2 legs. Something about it seemed human and not human at the same time. It had paper white, pasty skin, and its eyes seemed to be a bloodshot red. I wanted to believe it was some crazy homeless person or crackhead in the woods, but the way this thing moved, it wasn't human. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. And that's when the creature leaped. It hopped over to the deer, and suddenly 3 more pasty white creatures stepped out and swooped the deer away. 3 of them quickly swooped the deer carcass away into the darkness, but to our horror, one of the 4 just stood there and looked at us. Jaime and I were shaking. I consider myself normally a calm person, but my adrenaline was pumping. The creature shrieked and took a step forward. Jaime and I ran as fast as we could. We sprinted knowing that our lives may depend on it. I didn't even think of looking back. The shrieking got louder and louder, and we heard more and more footsteps following us. We came across Kevin and Taylor, and they seemed really confused. "Start the car and get us out of here," I yelled. Both of them were confused, but when they saw the look on Jaime and I's face, they knew there was no time for questions. We jumped in the car. Kevin quickly started it and stepped on the gas. As we were pulling out, we heard more shrieks coming up behind us. Taylor started to cry. As we were leaving the windy dirt road, one of the creatures came up unexpectedly from the side and lunged into the car. Kevin didn't even have time to react. The creature struck the side front bumper. None of us even wanted to think about turning back and seeing what we struck, but I managed to look through the rear window and saw it. The albino was completely unfazed. Didn't seem to be hurt by the moving car. It just stared at us menacingly as we drove away. When we got back to the main city, we explained to Kevin and Taylor what exactly happened. We debated calling the police, but we knew that for 1, we would be incriminating ourselves for the drugs in our car, and 2, the police would never believe us. The car had a massive dent in the front bumper from the collision. Unfortunately, a big dent in the front bumper isn't enough to prove the existence of blood albinos. We rarely have talked about this. Jaime and I have mentioned it once or twice briefly, but we would both immediately stop talking about it. Kevin and Taylor were skeptical at first, but when they saw how frightened I was, they took our word for it. Let this be a message to anyone who wants to visit the Hicks Road in San Jose. Bring a friend, and go at daytime. You do not want to meet whoever we encountered there.
The time this story happened was only a year ago, me being 15 and living with, at the time, just my mom and my 10-year-old brother. My dad was staying somewhere else for the time being. At this time in the story, we were moving from house to house, financially not very stable, but getting by. We had found a house conveniently right next to one of the largest cemeteries in town, and I didn't mind it, but both my brother and my mom found it creepy. The house had 3 stories if you included the basement. Something about that basement scared me. It always felt like something or someone was down there, and that whole year we lived there, I never stepped foot down there. Not once. To give some context, my room was upstairs. There were 3 rooms up there, and I'll tell you how it looked for the sake of the story. There was the staircase that went up to a landing, and then a smaller staircase leading to the 2nd floor. My room was the first thing that you saw. My brother's room was to the right of it, and the extra room was to the left. My mom kept the extra room locked, saying that it was unsafe to be in there. Everything about this house felt wrong. According to both of my parents, the house was extremely old, being built in the 1800s. It was freaky. All the doors had those creepy old keyholes, and the way that the house was structured seemed unnatural and weird. The turns and placement of rooms was odd, only making the house seem creepier. I never minded it until this happened. I had been texting my friend Chloe before deciding to set my phone down and finally get some sleep. I don't remember what time it was, but it was late. I fell asleep rather quickly, being worn out from school and stress. However, I'm a light sleeper. Any noise could wake me up. I was turned on my side facing the wall when I heard the loud creaks of the stairs. The steps stopped at the landing, creaking ever so slightly, as if someone was rocking on their feet. I ignored it, but it did make my heart race as I heard the steps begin again, stopping at the top of the stairs. It was probably my brother. No big deal.
Closing my eyes, I heard my door creak open, and footsteps come into my room, stopping at the edge of my bed. Someone was standing over me, just watching. A bit freaked out, I did a side glance, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw my brother standing over me, and letting out an annoying grunt, I asked, "What do you want?" There was no response. Sighing and closing my eyes, I rolled onto my side. I opened my eyes to look at him again, and my heart stopped. He wasn't there. Standing up, I trudged to his room, but he wasn't there. No one was there. After that, I felt uneasy as I turned to go back to my room, but I froze. That door that was always locked was open. Did he go in there? I remember going in and grabbing my phone, turning on the flashlight and just standing there, staring at my floor. Something felt so wrong. My gut told me that I wasn't alone. There was someone in there with me, and they were not good. Slowly I went to shine my light into the room to see if my brother was there. There was nothing. At this point I heard my heart pounding in my ears as I shut the door, quietly going back to my room. I told myself it was my imagination as I laid back in bed and closed my eyes. I fell asleep eventually, silently muttering prayers under my breath to put my mind at ease. I did question my brother the next morning if he had gone upstairs, but he just told me no. Ever since that night, every night I hear footsteps coming from upstairs, and they stop at my door. I began to have nightmares of a very tall man coming up from the basement and to my door, peering his pale face inside to look at me with his unnaturally wide and terrifying smile. Not only that, but the door that my mom kept locked since then would be found wide open almost every morning I woke up. Something was wrong with that house, and I'm just glad we don't live there anymore.
I'm ashamed to say it, but it needs to be said. I screwed up on my job, and a man died because of it. Not just a man I was being paid to protect. Usually I can be forgiven for making a mistake on my first job. However, when it's your first job protecting another man from outside dangers, one mistake can be the last. In retrospect, hindsight, whatever word you use, I wish I'd never agreed to taking the job. Just being a large-built man with a license to carry doesn't make you qualified to be a private security. This all being said, I took the job. The client losing his life is a direct result of my negligence. Maybe if I discuss what happened, I can relieve myself of a small amount of this burden. However, I can assure you I know the guilt will never truly fade away. The job came out of nowhere. Mike, a close friend of mine, had been a bodyguard on and off for years. He made it clear the job was a one-time only deal. No other guys he knew were available on such short notice. His next client was coming into town in the morning. Mike needed someone with a carry permit to back him up. He knew I had one, so I got the call. He assured me it wasn't a dangerous situation, but he liked to have another guy to watch his and the client's back. I was somewhat nervous initially, but the money I was offered was too good to pass up. We met up at his place later that night. He gave me a rough outline of what I was expected to do. Once it had been all laid out before me, it seemed simple enough. Although this would be his first time with this particular client, he assured me once more it would be simple. After all, the guys with the real problems always had their own staff. Our client was a regular suit and tie in town for some business. 4 hours of work and he'd be back on a plane home. The morning of the job, we met with the client at the airport. A third guy, Roger, was doing the driving for us that day. He's a retired SWAT officer who picked up the occasional driving job for Mike. He'd had a boatload of training in evasive maneuvers while he was in the Army. Plus, he could be a third gun in an emergency. He drove us to the client's first appointment, and everything was going well. From what I could make out, the dude was a wholesale jeweler out of London. Stuff didn't really start falling apart until we were leaving the second place. As we exited the jeweler's store, I noticed a sketchy-looking, possibly Middle Eastern guy. He was standing in front of the place next door. When he noticed us leaving, he pulled a knife from his pocket and ran towards us. Before he could get anywhere near us, I instinctively moved toward him. He turned and ran, and I foolishly gave chase. I'd gotten somewhere around 30 yards and heard a barrage of gunshots behind me. I turned around just in time to see Mike go down. The client was already on the ground and wasn't moving. Roger was standing next to the car, shooting at 2 men running from the scene. By the time I'd drawn my pistol, the firefight had ended. It was clear to me I'd messed up. As Roger and I checked Mike and the client for signs of life, a weak few words came from Mike. "I hope you won't be offended if I don't ask for your help again." We had a brief chuckle, but we both knew this wasn't a laughing matter. Roger confirmed that the client was in fact dead. I rode to the hospital with Mike, and Roger stayed behind with the cops. This big mess made no sense. I knew I could trust Mike. He said the client indicated no current danger to his life. We were supposed to be only there to prevent robberies. We'd both seen the guy with a load of stones on him, so no flags went up. Regardless, considering the number of guys in on the hit, I had a strong feeling we didn't get the whole story. I'd been waiting for news on Mike for about half an hour when Roger finally showed. The cops were right behind him. Now it was my turn. When they were done with me, they wanted to talk to Mike, but he was still in surgery. 2 hours later, we got the good news. He was going to make it, but he'd be in the hospital for the next week at the least. For the next 9 days, I stayed at his side. It was the least I could do. The following morning, we had our first discussion since the shooting. "You do realize the guy with the blade was a decoy, right?" "Became pretty obvious once I heard you all yell at me to come back." "Listen, don't feel guilty. It's not your fault. I've fallen for dumber things than that." We continued our talk for a while until Mike fell asleep. No matter what he said, though, I'd always feel bad. A man lost his life, after all. The detective showed up later that day and pumped him for any new info, but Mike had none. Mike was released 8 days later. Neither of us heard anything new until Roger called Mike 5 days later with some inside information he'd gotten from one of his pals. The client had been far from honest with us. He had hired us because he was involved in a deal with some men in which he screwed them out of $100,000. They had made it known if he was to return to the States, he'd be whacked. If Mike would have known this beforehand, he wouldn't have taken the job. That's likely why the dirtbag kept it quiet. Somehow this bit of info had made it past the background check. Nonetheless, even a crook doesn't deserve to be sprayed with bullets on a public street. We were only hearing it from their side. It could have all been a huge misunderstanding. After my anger cooled, it became obvious to me that I was just deflecting my feelings onto the client. Thief or not, I was responsible for the safety of the man. Not only had my mistake gotten him killed, a very good friend of mine almost did too. When Mike's back in fighting shape, I'm sure he'll return to security work, albeit in a slightly more careful manner. I'm just glad he's still kicking. I hope he gets someone in the future far more competent than myself. When it comes to me, I think I'll stick to construction. It appears to be a whole lot safer.
This story happened to my brother, and it's told from his perspective. On Halloween of 2017, I went trick-or-treating with my friends who all called Harvey, Michael, and Daniel. We were all around 14 to 15 years old, and really just wanted to make the most of Halloween, as we had so much homework starting the 10th grade, and we probably would never be able to trick-or-treat again. Anyway, we were all walking down this random street at like 9:30, when we saw one house with insane over-the-top Halloween decorations that looked like it cost up to about $500. The four of us walked up to the house and rang the bell. Some 50-year-old looking man opened the door and said, "No need to yell. Just come on in and you'll get your sweets." Daniel told the guy, asked the guy, "Can you just bring the candy out here?" The guy didn't even answer. And so the four of us just walked away, not saying a single word. But of course, this story wouldn't be scary if it didn't end here. We were walking down my street when Harvey pointed out, "Guys, that man is following us." We all looked out behind us and saw the same 50-year-old looking man walking about 25 feet behind us. The four of us bolted all the way to the house. We ran to my house, we thrust open the front door, entered my house, and locked the door. The four of us were just hyperventilating as if we just ran an ultra marathon. I was starting to settle down when Jason said, "Look at the window." We all looked, and there he was, the old man looking through one of my windows. My parents were on a vacation, and my brother was at his friend's Halloween party, so we couldn't tell them. But what really made this horrifying was that I could see this guy holding a gun in his hand. I yelled at my friends, and we ran upstairs to call the police. The officers arrived in about 10 minutes. The man wasn't on my property anymore, but we remembered the house, so that's where we went. The cops went there, searched the whole place, and came out with the man in chains. It turned out the house was vacant, and the man was a serial killer who escaped from prison a month ago. If my friends and I are able to go trick-or-treating again, we're avoiding the street that this house was on. And who knows what that guy was really going to do if we went in. I'm glad this happened when we were teenagers and not when we were 9 years old. All I can say is if you're trick-or-treating, make sure that the house owner is completely normal.
Growing up in a working-class Latino family, we didn't have the luxury of taking lavish vacations throughout the year. However, that didn't stop us from exploring the natural wonders of Southern California through camping. At a young age, my sister and I understood the value of camping through our shared respect for Mother Nature. Over time, we mastered surviving in the outdoors, so much so that we desired to explore new campgrounds throughout the state. On one such occasion, a coworker of my father overheard him talking about his summer vacation plans and suggested to him a new campground to check out. To this day, my parents nor I are unable to remember the name of the campsite, yet we all agree that it was somewhere in the hills of San Diego County. My father was excited for the prospect of visiting a new national park and packed up the car for the customary family summer retreat. The drive up to the campsite was long and dangerous. Even though we were driving during the day, the steepness of the mountain, coupled with the numerous blind turns, had everyone sitting on the edge of their seats. Arguments soon erupted amongst us, as we didn't find any signs indicating where to go. This was in the age before smartphones and GPS. Eventually, we convinced our father to stop and ask for directions. As the campground came into view, we all let out a collective sigh of relief. We made it. And yet, the place did not look like it was a national park at all. There wasn't a ranger station or a welcome center anywhere in sight. The lake appeared murky like a bog, whereas the campground itself was devoid of life. A proverbial ghost town, with the only inhabitants being us. With our bewilderment aside, we cautiously surveyed the area, finding any clues that will guide us to the keeper of this place. Out in the distance, we saw a crumbling, open sign dangling in the window of a dilapidated diner. Just as the sign implied, we entered the establishment to inquire about the place. Pushing the creaking door open, we were greeted by the owner of the diner, a gaunt-looking man who I would now say was plucked straight out of the movie The Hills Have Eyes. "Well, how can I help y'all folks on this fine day?" My dad replied. "We made reservations to camp here, but I'm not sure if this is the right place." We then handed the man our booking papers for him to inspect. With his bony fingers grasping the pages, he replied, Yeah, you have the right place. I'm the groundskeeper of this here national park. Let me finish some paperwork on my end, and I'll get things ready for you and your family to stay here with us." As he wobbled off to the back of the diner, my sister and I retreated to the safety of our car. Although we were children at the time, we both felt a sense of unease, even dread at the thought of spending the night here. Despite our worries, our parents reassured us that the vacation had only just begun, albeit with a few bumps along the way. As we neared the site, all of our concerns were tossed out the window, as it was time to transform this empty lot into our secure encampment. The rest of the day came and went, as our campsite was beginning to take shape. The sounds of our radio, along with the rhythmic banging of the hammer, were the only echoes greeting us as the sun began to set. This detail stood out to me, due to the fact it was early July here in Southern California, and there are always people camping around this time. In either case, we all just brushed it aside and thought that more people would arrive by tomorrow. And they did. On the following day of the trip, my father went fishing at the lake. While he was off on his own adventure, my sister and I decided that it was time to have one of our own. Recruiting the aid of our mother, we set out to explore the campgrounds. To our surprise and elation, we discovered that this campground had its own public swimming pool. With our minds made up, the three of us got into our bathing suits, slathered on the sunscreen, and made our way to the pool. Soon my sister and I were splashing around in the water without a care in the world, until I noticed 3 suspicious men, dressed entirely in black. They came and sat at one of the chairs at the opposite end of the pool from where our mother was watching us. At first, I thought the men were new campers that had recently arrived at the grounds to examine the swimming pool, but to my dismay, the men just huddled around each other and whispered incomprehensible things while staring intently at the two of us. My mother's instincts caught on to the predatory behavior, and she decided to cut our excursion to the swimming pool short. When my father arrived from the lake, he said he was unable to catch any fish, and that the fish he did find were all belly up dead in the water. My mother then informed my father of the 3 suspicious-looking men eyeing my sister and I at the pool. This infuriated him. My father, brandishing his machete, stormed out in search of the group of men, ostensibly to talk some sense into them. Some time passed, and my father arrived back at the campsite, dismayed that he did not find the men, only a mother and her 2 little boys. This point may sound insignificant at first, but it will become important later in the story. As night fell, my sister and I were preparing to go to sleep, when we were suddenly jolted awake by the pleading screams of a woman. Her pleas were joined by the cries of 2 young children, and various male voices demanding their silence. My father recognized the woman's voice as the mother he saw earlier in the day camping alone with her 2 kids. My father, who is a former Marine, loaded his rifle and concealed his hunting knife. He then proceeded to tell my mother to take care of us, while handing her a loaded gun. I then saw my father head out towards the campsite, where the single mother and her children were staying. My sister and I were petrified when we noticed the terror-stricken look on our mother's face. As the yelling escalated, 2 thunderous bangs from the rifle rang out. Which put an end to the chaos. Seconds later, we heard the crackling branches closing in, as someone moved quickly towards us. My mother, with eyes wide and knuckles clenched, aimed into the darkness, ready to protect us at all costs. To our relief, my father emerged from the shadows with a fearful mother and her 2 sobbing children. My father then claimed that he scared off the men who were harassing us at the pool and will be helping the mother pack her things to leave. To ensure that they made their way down the mountain safely, my father offered to follow her in our car until she got to the main highway. In a moment of reprieve, the woman held her children tight. We all assured her that their safety was of the utmost importance, and knowing my father, any form of aggression needs to be handled quickly. With pleasantries aside, my father departed yet again to help the mother pack up her campsite and leave this backwater excuse for a national park. The few rays of sunlight that streamed into our tent signaled the start of a new day, since our father had left to escort the small family from the imminent danger. With a look of apprehension on my mother's face, my sister and I started to pack up camp, knowing all too well that we did not want to risk our lives spending another night at this place. I was making my way to the bathrooms when my eye caught the glimpse of our car slowly making its way back to camp. I ran back to tell my mother and sister, who noticed the car as well, and soon the bloodshot eyes of my father behind the wheel came into view. As he exited the car, he informed us that the mother and her children made it safely to the highway. This was then followed by a long pause, with my father saying, "Now let's get the hell out of here ourselves." With that, we all took our positions and packed up the rest of our camping gear. Before leaving this godforsaken place, my father informed the owner of the diner about what happened last night and about the 3 suspicious-looking men. The only thing that the emaciated-looking man said was, "Well, it's a damn shame that you and your family can't stay here a little longer." We then hightailed it out of there like bats out of hell, vowing never to return. Ever since this harrowing experience, my family and I have been unable to get my sister to go camping again. As time went on, I decided to ask my father where he had heard about that awful place, to which he added a new detail not previously disclosed. He mentioned that upon returning to work, he wanted to confront his coworker about the horrible camping recommendation he gave. When he tried to locate him, another coworker stated that the same man quit a couple of days before my father was going to return from vacation. My father was left speechless and confused upon hearing this. Was the man somehow connected to those 3 men? If so, what were their motives for harassing a family out in the middle of nowhere? The answers to these questions we will never know, but what I do know is this. If my father did not intervene on that fateful night, that single mother and her kids would have met a fate far worse than a failed camping trip. I'm not much of a storyteller, so bear with me. During the 90s, I went through a very rough time in my life. After a failed marriage, I became a bit of a nomad, wandering across country on foot with no particular destination. It was a stupid idea, but I was in a very hopeless place back then, and just looking to experience something new. I've been traveling down South Dakota and hitched a ride with a truck driver into Nebraska. For those of you who have never been to that state, there are large sections of land that go on for miles with nothing but cornfields lining either side of the road. We split ways at a rest stop, and I made my way into what I now know to be the Sand Hills of Nebraska. The Sand Hills region is one of the most isolated areas in the United States, 20,000 square miles of nothing but dunes and prairies. I planned on hitchhiking my way to the nearest town and catching a bus to visit a friend I had in Omaha. Full disclosure, I had absolutely no idea what the hell I was doing. I subscribed to the "I'll figure it out when I get there" mentality. At the time, I didn't know a whole lot about Nebraska, but I found out the hard way that this stretch of road was not ideal for hitchhiking. I barely saw any cars going down this road, and the ones that did completely ignored me. 12 hours had passed, and I was running low on food and water. I was utterly exhausted at this point, and I needed to find a place to rest for a while. I had about an hour left of daylight. Lucky for me, I happened to come upon an old farmhouse that was situated about a half-mile away from the main road. From a distance, I thought this place may have been occupied, but when I got closer, it was clear to me that this house was abandoned. This was around the fall, so weather in Nebraska wasn't terrible. However, the nights were a bit on the cold side, so I decided to hold up in this house for the night and continue my journey the next day. I had enough supplies to last me one more night. The house was your typical rotting husk. Smelled like mold, severe water damage, creaking floors, etc. The living room seemed to be the only decent place to settle down at, so I unpacked my sleeping bag and eventually dozed off. I woke up to the sound of floorboards creaking. I immediately sat up and listened. I could hear several pairs of footsteps thudding all around the house. They were coming from upstairs, downstairs, on the back porch outside, and even in the same room with me, but I didn't see a thing. I quickly got to my feet and walked over to the nearest window and peered out. What I saw was truly alarming and sent a wave of nausea through my entire body. Several cloaked figures were standing side by side. They appeared to be encircling the house. Because of the footsteps I heard, I thought there may have been people in the house with me. So in an effort to defuse things, I made another big-brain decision and spoke up. Hello? I'm sorry if I'm trespassing. I was just looking for a place to rest for the night. I thought this place was abandoned. Again, I'm sorry. All the footsteps stopped at once. An eerie silence followed. It was so quiet that I could have heard a mouse shitting in the corner. I got this real bad feeling in my gut, so I reached into my backpack and pulled out my hunting knife. I gathered the rest of my things and slowly moved out into the hallway. Aside from the mysterious figures outside, I was also thinking of what was making those footsteps inside the house. As I said, I heard several footsteps when I woke up, so I figured it wouldn't be long before I ran into someone inside the house. But after combing the entire downstairs, I didn't see or hear anything. I could tell something was very off. That bad feeling I mentioned earlier intensified, despite the fact that I knew there was a bunch of weirdos in cloaks waiting for me outside. Something told me that if I didn't leave the house that very moment, something terrible was going to happen to me. The house was located in a wide-open clearing. Beyond the clearing was a barrier of tall grass. When I left through the front door, I stopped directly in front of the house. No matter which direction I looked, I saw another hooded menace blocking my way. I suddenly felt this heat on my back. I quickly turned around and was shocked to see that the house I just left was now engulfed in flames. I cannot explain how this happened. Moments before, I was inside that house, walking around, and it was now on fire. I backed away. I decided that I was going to run through the figures and get the hell out of Dodge, but when I turned back around, the figures were nowhere in sight. Things were getting way too bizarre for me at that point. The only thing I knew for sure was that I had to get the fuck out of that place. When I got back out to the main road, I didn't stop walking until I finally got to a town, whose name I can't remember. The rest of my time in Nebraska went well, and I got my life together shortly after I got back home from my trip. As long as I live, I'll never forget that old farmhouse and those mysterious cloaked figures. This incident still baffles me to this day, but perhaps some things are best left unanswered. I was born, raised, and still live in Texas. I come from a family of hunters. It's pretty much a family tradition. I'm going to tell you about something that I experienced when I was 20 years old, back in 2005. My father had just been diagnosed with lung cancer, and everyone in my family was naturally devastated by this, especially me, since my dad and I were very close. I had a lot of other personal stuff going on in my life at the time, and I felt that I needed to go out for a few days just to clear my head. I decided to make it a solo hunting trip, and packed up some camping gear, along with my Marlin 336 that my dad gifted to me when I was 18. If I could get sentimental for a moment, my father ended up passing away 3 years after his diagnosis, and to this day, I still use that rifle for hunting. Anyways, I'd say this happened around late October, early November. I don't want to be too specific with a location, because technically, I wasn't supposed to be hunting in this specific area. However, I will disclose that it was near the Mexican border. This will be important later. I decided to set up camp for 3 days before heading back. I had been hunting on this land before with some friends of mine, and I knew the precautions to take not to be spotted by the game warden. I'm sure if there's any other hunters listening to this broadcast, they'll be more than happy to tell you that we often wipe our asses with the rulebook. Before anyone judges me too harshly, or the practice of hunting in general, I will say that I'm a very spiritual person, and I have a profound respect for Mother Nature. I don't leave trash everywhere, and every animal that I put down, I never let go to waste. I'll be the first to admit, there are hunters that give us a bad name, and me not following the rules is more of a middle finger to the government than it is to the sport of hunting. I once straight up beat the shit out of someone who was a friend of a friend for shooting a stray dog for absolutely no reason. If it's consolation to anyone, I handed him a horrible ass-whooping for that. But I digress. The first day went off without a hitch, no problems whatsoever, aside from the fact that there was no game to be found anywhere. So I figured that I would head further south the next day to see if my luck would improve. Other hunters knew about this restricted location and may have already cleaned out this area. As night fell, I found myself sprawled out next to my truck, just staring up at the night sky, wondering if me and my dad would ever take another hunting trip together. That's when I heard the sound of footsteps slowly making their way through a nearby brush. This was alarming for obvious reasons. Whoever they were, they had the drop on me. I knew better than to light up a campfire under these circumstances, but if this person was roaming around in the dark without a flashlight, they may have had some kind of night vision apparatus, giving them the advantage. I was concerned, because if you were looking at me through the trees at that particular moment, it would have appeared that I was sleeping. I was in this odd position where I was resting on top of my sleeping bag with a blanket, because I felt claustrophobic being fully immersed in a sleeping bag. It was a good thing too, because this meant I was able to mobilize quickly, and something told me that I only had seconds to make a decision. I rolled sideways, and as soon as I did, I caught a quick glimpse of a muzzle flash coming from the tree line directly in front of me. I felt dirt fly up and hit my back from the bullet striking the ground next to me. I scrambled to my feet as more shots rang out from the trees, one of them shattering the passenger side window of my truck. I took cover behind the bed of my pickup and quickly drew the .38 snub-nose that I had strapped to my ankle. After the gunfire died down, I laid flat on the ground and returned fire in the direction of the trees from under the truck. I heard several sets of footsteps fleeing from the area, but I held my position in case my theory about the night vision was correct. With only 2 rounds left in my .38, I pretty much spent the rest of that night underneath my truck with my pistol aimed at the darkness until the sun came out and illuminated my surroundings. I very cautiously got out from beneath my vehicle and packed up my gear as quickly as I could and hightailed it out of there. Later on, when I told a friend of mine about the incident, he said he wished I would have told him that I was heading that way. He would have warned me that the Mexican cartel started using that area to smuggle contraband and people across the nearby border. This friend of mine was a Mexican immigrant himself, and had several family members mixed up in the cartel and coyote groups, so needless to say, I trusted his word. All things considered, I think I got off pretty easy. Had I been in my sleeping bag that night, I have no doubt that bullet would have nailed me. These days, I stick to the designated hunting grounds. Some things are just not worth the risk.
A few years ago, I lived in my car. I was fresh out of college and overwhelmed with student debt. And being young, dumb, and 21, I thought car living was a good way to save money. I live in Southern California, so the rent is high and the weather is temperate enough to make this possible year-round. One night, I decided to park in a neighborhood I thought I knew well. It was right by the beach and a couple blocks next to an ex-boyfriend of mine, so I felt safe there, as I had walked the streets at night plenty of times. I parked, locked the doors, hung up the curtains so no one could look in, plugged in my earplugs so the cars passing wouldn't wake me, and fell asleep. Now my earplugs were effective, but crappy, and I could always count on them falling off in the middle of the night. I actually preferred this because it meant I could fall asleep, but still hear my phone alarm in the morning. It was about 2 a.m. when I woke up to my earplugs already have fallen off, and something feeling wrong. Odd scratching noises were coming from the window. It started at the passenger side door, and then moved to the back seat doors. I froze, unsure of what to make of it, painfully aware that I leave my windows slightly cracked at night for ventilation. I honestly didn't know what to do, so I stayed frozen, trying to make sense of it all. That's when the flashlight turned on, and some man unmistakably was shining his light in, trying to find a crack in the curtains, and to my horror, he found one and shined it right where my face was. It's hard to explain, but the position of my head made it so I could piece together what was happening, based on the light everywhere, but he couldn't see my eyes. The scratching then continued, and I knew I was screwed. This went from potential attempted car theft to someone knowing I was in the car. I was literally paralyzed with fear and couldn't will myself to grab the baseball bat that I had. However, my last year of college, I took a class called Prad, which stood for Rape, Aggression, Defense, and remembered the number one rule: yell confidently and confrontationally at the man. I wish I could say I screamed something truly bad, but what left my lips was a loud, aggravated, and forceful, "Excuse me." It was super lame, but it echoed. To my immense relief, I hear the sounds of his footsteps running away at top speed. But I kid you not, the man was laughing as he ran, like it was some kind of game. I was still paralyzed, but eventually, him running gave me the courage to get up, grab my bat, and shove my way to the front seat, where I started the car and sped away. I didn't see him, and I spent the night at a friend's house. I live in an apartment now. It wasn't until the next morning I realized I had parked 1 block away from a bar, and, at the time of the incident, the bar had just closed.
When I was 11, almost 12, the woman living above me was a coke dealer. The night of my 12th birthday, she went missing. Not long after, her boyfriend came down to ask if he could use our phone. This was 2004, so having a cell phone was more of an exception than a rule, at least in my area. For a little context, I was home alone at the time while my mom was at work about a 5-minute walk away. My mom had let our neighbor and her boyfriend come in to use our phone several other times before, so I assumed nothing was wrong with it and let him in, bringing him into the living room, which is towards the front of our apartment, to use the phone in there. He picks up the receiver, dials a number, waits a few seconds, then hangs up the phone. He does this a couple of more times before the front door of the building opens. You can easily hear the front door open from where we are. It's a very heavy door, the walls are thin, and the way our building is set up, it's a small, old, single-family house converted into apartments. My mom's apartment was the only one on the first floor, and our upstairs neighbor's apartment was the only one above us. Irrelevant, but there was also a much smaller apartment below us. My neighbor's boyfriend looked at me, put his pointer finger to his lips, like he was trying to shush me, and told me not to tell anyone he was there before speed-walking to my room at the other end of the apartment. I watched my bedroom door close right before there was a loud, hard, cop-like knock on the door. My jaw dropped as I opened the door to see a police officer. He asked if my neighbor's boyfriend was there, and being scared, I stammered out, "Yeah, he just went into my room." The officer asked if he could come in, which I agreed to, and as he was coming in, he asked if he could let his partner in the back door and lead them to my room. We walked together to the back of the apartment, and I let his partner in. The back door to the apartment was right next to my bedroom door, but we had to walk around the kitchen table to get there. There was just barely enough space between the two doors to fit a narrow rectangular table against it without blocking the path to either door. As I let them into my room, I watched as they pulled my neighbor's boyfriend out of my bedroom closet. As they brought him out of my room and towards the back door, which just led to an enclosed fire escape, they told me to go wait in the living room while they brought him out the back door. I walked back to the living room, and after they closed the door, I could hear what they were saying, and I could hear the distinct sound of metal clicking, and quickly realizing that he had been handcuffed. Still scared, I waited for the police car to drive away before grabbing my keys, making sure that the back door was locked, and locking the front door on my way out before running to my mom's work, crying. Pretty sure I cut the 5-minute trip into about 2 minutes, and I've never been a fast runner. I was fueled entirely on adrenaline and fear at that point, and I just wanted my mom. When I told her what had happened, my mom was so angry that he had used me the way he had, hiding out in a child's bedroom closet of all places to try to keep the cops from finding him. She gave me a short but gentle lecture that night about not letting people in to use the phone, telling me that I was not to let people use our phone, even if I knew them, unless she was home. I don't want to know what exactly he was wanted for, nor do I want to know what would happen if the cops had not shown up. I don't know if he had known that the cops were on their way and had come to my apartment specifically to hide from them, or if he was up to something else and knew it was the cops when the front door of the building was opened.
I work summers as a camp counselor in the northern parts of Ontario, Canada. On the date this particular incident occurred, I was camping with a group of 10-year-old boys on the same lake the summer camp was based on. So like a routine camping trip, we canoed out to the site and set up our tents. Me and my co-counselor Mike take turns supervising the kids while they swim, build forts, and play games, etc. We cook some food over the fire, sit around and tell stories, cook s'mores, the typical Canadian camping experience. Around 9:30-ish, I tell the kids it's time for bed, and they head into their tents, which were positioned a small walk away from the shoreline, but still in line of sight from where we had the fire pit. So the kids have gone to bed, and me and Mike are talking by the water smoking a cigarette, just basically hanging out, before we decide to head into our tent and call it a night. What happened next still troubles me to this day and remains my go-to scary campfire story. We were both gazing into the pitch-black night water when we saw a small light approaching us slowly and slightly above water level. We speculated what it could possibly be for a few minutes before it came close enough for us to see that it was mounted on the front of a kayak and that someone was approaching our campsite. Now, it is important to note that as a camp counselor, part of our training goes over how to deal with stranger encounters in an environment where we are responsible for a group of children on public property. I was prepared to give the mystery paddler the typical speech about how we are camping with a group from a recognized organization, and we would respectfully ask that they find another campsite. However, this person's appearance shook me to the bone as the light drew nearer. Paddling this kayak was a woman who looked to be in her 60s. She had incredibly long wisps of gray hair that was trailing in the water. Her skin looked like old leather, and her dead-looking eyes were tough to spot under all her wrinkles. She looked directly at me, and when she spoke, I realized she was missing most of her teeth. "Are all your children safe in bed?" she asked me, pointing in the direction of the tents. Not really knowing how to respond, and quite frankly, terrified, I responded by telling her that they were fine and that she had to leave. "That's good. Just as expected for this time," she said with a smile, then turned her kayak and paddled off into the night. At this point in time, myself and Mike were legitimately very creeped out, not only by the appearance of this mystery woman who resembled a corpse, but also her inquiry on the whereabouts and safety of the kids that we had brought on this trip. Not knowing what else to do, we grabbed our hunting knives and sat by the fire after checking on the kids. Half an hour later, across the lake, a female counselor was leading another trip for kids the same age group. She sent me a text, which read something along the lines of, "Hey Sean, stop messing with us. This isn't funny. My kids are really creeped out." I instantly called her and let her know that I had just seen someone near my campsite that seemed eerie and that I was not trying to play a joke on her. Apparently, one of her kids had opened their tent door to go to the bathroom and saw a woman with long gray hair standing a few feet away with her arms outstretched towards them. When I was 14, I was sent to a mental institution. Here's why. I don't have any friends, and I kept to myself. I loved to look at pictures of dead people, and to be honest, I still do. My parents struggled with trying to make me act normal, and I have no explanation for you or for them. I didn't like other kids. I didn't like anyone, not even my parents. The only person that I did like was my little brother Harold, who was just like me. He was quiet, and he didn't have any friends either. We would play outside and hang out all the time, and everything was great. Until this one night. Harold and I got into an argument, and he told me that he wished he could kill our parents. I wasn't close with our parents, and like I said before, I didn't even like them, but I never felt like hurting them. Harold told me that not only did he want to hurt them, he wanted to cut them open with the pocket knife in the garage. He wanted to take the knife and slit them open. This made me cry. I ran to my parents' room, probably like 2 o'clock in the morning, screaming and crying. Harold followed me and was screaming that I was lying over and over. I screamed and told my parents what Harold said and what he wanted to do. My mom started crying uncontrollably, and my dad started breathing really heavy. Obviously, what I told them was scaring them, and Harold was crying too at this point. The next day, my dad took me to the mental institution. For the longest time, I was in that hospital, angry, not understanding why I had to live there and Harold didn't. It wasn't until 7 years later that I learned why. My dad came to visit me one day, and when I asked about Harold, as I always did, he finally said it. Harold didn't exist. I ran into their room that night, screaming and arguing with myself about how I wanted to kill them. But I didn't want to. This was out of this world, insanely scary. Please forgive the short length. Not much happened. I was 11 years old, living in Boston with my dad. I woke up one night super late for an unknown reason. You know how sometimes you just wake up, look around your room, and then fall back asleep? Yep, that's what happened. I woke up not sure what time, but sometime in the middle of the night. I was looking around the room, and sitting in the darkness of my open closet, I saw a face. A face I had never seen before. Someone was sitting in my closet looking at me. The ability to move my limbs completely left me. I was frozen. I stared at this person for what felt like an hour. Trying to remember now, I'd say it was really only about 20 seconds. Whoever it was reached their arm out of the darkness in front of them and slid the closet door closed, looking into my eyes the entire time. The door closed, and I lay there frozen for probably another 20 seconds. And then I realized I had to leave this room. Obviously, there was no way I was going to go back to sleep. I got up as silently as I could and walked out of my bedroom, which the door was cracked open. I ran to my dad's room and went inside. I woke him up, and naturally he was shocked when I told him that someone was in my closet. He told me to stay in his room, and he went to check. The thought of something happening to my dad scared the hell out of me, so I was crying, waiting for him to come back. After a minute or two, he finally came back and told me that no one was there. Cliché ending, I know. I will say this, I do not care if people believe me or not. It really happened. I was not dreaming. When I left my room, whoever it was in the closet left as well. The front door, the back door, and most of our windows were all unlocked. Stupid, I know, but we were ignorant. This happened 6 years ago, and when I try to remember the face, I can't visualize the details, except one thing. One thing I have always been sure of. It was a man, and he was missing teeth. How do I know? Because he was smiling at me the whole time.